Testing. I don't know whether I need to use this microphone or not. What does it sound like this way? Do I need the mic? I probably do for the back. I want to also apologize for this sudden change of plans, but unfortunately the orchestra canceled my pass. And it was only given a few weeks ago, and then some events in Chicago made it important that I'm there at least part of the time tomorrow. And so with the usual rat race that you get in this business, you just rush here and rush there. See, this is what's happened when you have good equipment. At home, I have to get much closer to it. Can you hear that now? 1, 2? Yeah. Well, what I was going to say, that I should really have spent a great deal of time preparing this clinic, but Harvey told me that it was going to be an informal session, and I took him at his word. So I came completely unprepared, and I did bring a horn, but I haven't touched it yet, so I will play and try to see what the horn is like and whether I can find the notes. But you're going to have a very good chance to catch an unprepared man in many ways and see what he can do in a professional approach, in a sense that I don't have notes or anything. But what I wanted to do was to find out in a group just who I'm speaking to. Now, Harvey tells me that we have quite a few composers in the group, and so I think there has to be some orientation to what the composers need to know. Now, I assume that the bulk of the group here will be tuba players. Am I right? I see they let a treble clef individual in, but he's a friend, so that's all right. Now, we have 2 short clinics, and to try to be of some use so that you folks can get something out of this, I'm going to keep this informal. I want you to feel free to raise your hand, interrupt anything that I say. I want to start out usually where I'm doing a clinic with younger groups and so forth. I find that I have to do a rather elementary type of clinic and go to the basic grounding of just tone production. I'm not sure that that's required with a more advanced group, but I'm going to bring my horn out. I found really that it's much easier to play than it is to talk anyway. We do so much of it, and it's a good way to get started. And as I say, I haven't played yet today, so we'll just make this a test. It'll be A, B, C, or you can flunk me. I'll be right with you. I'm sure you won't need a mic for the horn. It's a big one. I'm not going to use music at this point. I just start out warming up because I haven't played yet today, and I don't know which mouthpiece I'll use. I've got about 6 or 7 of them here. This is what happens, you see, when I'm at home and I start the practice. I think that this type of approach is not a complete waste of time because all of you actually are in an art form. You have to communicate. You communicate with sounds. I'm communicating with words, but my art form primarily is one with sounds. Now, we talk about warm-up. Actually, my wife was a ballet dancer. In fact, I used to work her act. That's how I met her originally. And I used to watch my wife warm up. It was very interesting. She would go up to a wall and put one leg up on the top end of the wall, and the other she's still standing on the floor, and she'd just press right up close. And this is very important for ballet dancers to do it, but on tubas I could never quite achieve anything like that. I wanted to say that warm-up for us, the words warm-up in a physiological sense are very interesting. Because if you take an actual temperature sensing device and you take an athlete before he starts to warm up and just put a sensor on the knee, you'll find that as this gentleman does his warm-up exercises, the blood supply is increasing in the region, the tissues become flexible, and he is not going to be so apt to tear fibers with a large blood supply in the knee or the other parts of him, of course, that he's warming up. And it's very important because he can create physical damage if he fails to warm up. Now, on a brass instrument, warm-up is extremely important also, but for different reasons. In other words, the lips, actually, these beautiful red lips, mine are not so beautiful, but when you meet certain people, you'll admire the nice red lips, and usually they're red because they have a very thin membrane covering them, but there is a marvelous blood supply in the lip. And as a result, you're really, if you were to use temperature sensing devices on the lip, you will find very little difference before and after warm-up. What I'm trying to indicate is we do warm up. We couple ourselves to the instrument for music making. Those of us in the professional sense rarely cool off enough that we would require a massive stage of warm-up. In other words, we had a difficult program to play last night, and I'm sure that I can be functional on the instrument when I start out right now, more or less. Now, I'll just play a moment. Valves don't work. We should really do something about that. Well, we'll play open notes in. Now, I don't think I'll use that mouthpiece. I think I'll use a different one. That's my regular one. Let's try something else. I suppose that you might have noticed quite a difference in tone when I switched mouthpieces. Actually, the one I'm using now is a rather bowl-shaped, or you might say cup, similar to what the trumpets use, but in a greatly enlarged sense. In other words, it is a mouthpiece that has a very definite cup shape, rather small throat, fast tapering backbore. With a large horn of this type, it gives it a little more response. It moves it somewhat in the direction of the smaller tuba, and in, you might say, characteristic works of the French school, if I don't oil this valve, I don't suppose I could play fast enough to want to do anything anyway, but there's a much faster response. You can get the same thing on the different cone-shaped cup. But for the contrabass tuba, in other words, if we wanted to bring out the fundamental in the tone, we would be using more of the cone-shaped mouthpiece and a rather large one. What I'm trying to indicate to those of you who are playing in the audience, you have three variables. You have the variable of the horn, you have the variable of the mouthpiece, and you have the very large variable of the player. I'm trying to indicate some of the more mechanical variables before I get to the player. If I could, if somebody would bring me a very nice shiny baritone, I will call that, instead of a baritone, a Piccolo tuba, and demonstrate a little on that also, with a special mouthpiece which has the tuba rim. But in relation to what we do on the contrabass tuba, you might liken it to what the trumpeter would do with his normal B-flat or C trumpet, and his trumpet an octave higher, his piccolo trumpet. We do very much the same thing, of course, with a tuba, and the terminology sometimes gets a little out of hand. So we'll call it a baritone or whatever you choose. But what I want to indicate is that those of you who are playing in ensemble, will say if you happen to have a very large tuba and you need to lighten the tone, then of course an excellent means is to use different mouthpieces. It's one of the loudest stands I've ever played on. I have here a little F-tuba mouthpiece, which fortunately will fit into this. Let's see what it sounds like when played in a big tuba. I suppose most of you would recognize that from Madame Butterfly. A nice little soprano lady sings that, but that doesn't mean we can't play it on the tuba. If we happen to like it, we can go home and do it in our studio. But I think you can hear that the introduction of the variability of the mouthpiece right away is altering the tonal characteristic of the instrument very much. Makes a nice little test number for testing mouthpieces. But instead of running out, my friends with the instrument manufacturers won't like what I'm about to say, but instead of writing out a very large fat check sometimes for another instrument, many a time you can merely take your rim. It's advisable to keep the same rim if possible, so the musculatures remain the same. And then by using an altered cup, you can very definitely increase the strength of the overtones and decrease the strength of the fundamental. If you used wave analysis on one of these instruments at the time I'm using this mouthpiece, you would find that the fundamental has lessened dramatically and the overtones have increased. Now, this was an F-tuba mouthpiece designed primarily for the F-tuba. The one I used, the second one that I used was it's an adjustable cup. I can adjust the length to about anything I want, except I dropped it and it's jammed and I can't budge it. But when it works, you can adjust it for, maybe a half inch, and there's a very considerable change in tone quality. Now, those of you who are using very small instruments can do the opposite. In other words, by going to the larger mouthpieces, you will introduce stronger fundamental and immediately begin to lessen the overtones. And sometimes the bandmasters will be very happy because at that time you will be simulating the sound of the larger contrabass tuba, and you're using the variability of the mouthpiece, which costs far less than the variability of the tuba. I haven't gotten into the variability of the player because that's a can of worms. We have to take a lot of time when we go into this one. But again, let's see, I have all sorts of them here. I'll take the larger one again. I thought I might have one of the real king-size mouthpieces, but I have still another one. Mr. Phillips would be interested in this one because it's a con number 2, but we changed it. Now, again, if I had the normal con number 2, I'd like to hear the difference of this. Dr. Fred Young, he's a tuba player in Pittsburgh, and he's a physicist, a very brilliant man, and a very fine tuba player, but he does not play professionally, and as a result, sometimes his insight is to the challenge he has to meet in the concert band that he plays with, or in the work that he's doing personally with the tuba, and sometimes it doesn't quite follow that this would be a satisfactory answer for the professional musician. But just recently, he came to see me in Chicago, and he said, "Jake, what do you need the back bore and a mouthpiece for?" And I couldn't answer him. I don't know what we need it for. Through empirical observation, I've always had a back bore, a throat and a taper, and we've always used that. So he had a mouthpiece with him, and he had drilled out the back bore, and he had just a cylindrical pipe. And I sent this con number 2 to Pittsburgh, and it came back, with a hole I could stick my head in, I think. It's the same size in the throat, in the cup of the mouthpiece, as it is at the tip. And again, we have quite a change in quality. I felt that this tends to bring out the overtones tend to be emphasized, and the fundamental is de-emphasized. These mouthpieces, I'm using a Con Helleberg and the Con number 2, they're both practically the same. So you'll hear again the difference the mouthpiece can make. Getting very dry up here. That's from the long drive and the long night last night. You know, when you play a tuba, you use a lot of breath. Bill Bell used to sing a song, it takes a lot of breeze to blow the tuba. Now, also, in a physiological sense, you lose a great deal of moisture of the body through your breath. This is one of the chief ways that we lose moisture. And so we have to make sure we replenish it quite frequently. And this is water. I'm going to demonstrate again on the normal throat and back bore. Now I'll take the cylindrical throat. It's so strange when I look at it, I have to pause because I can hardly believe it. You'd think it wouldn't play at all, but... Very definite change, right, Harvey? Whether it's good or bad, I won't say. But it's a very comfortable mouthpiece to play on. But this bears investigation, and this is a university, and so I thought I would bring it up. There are certain characteristics in playing that are very interesting. I think tone production is somewhat easier with the large throat and by removing the back bore. I think we lose a certain amount of the character of sound that we're used to with the smaller throat and the large taper. Intonation holds well but goes to a different level. Does change the intonation, but still within itself it's quite good. Now, as I say, mouthpiece as a variable is something very good to consider. Now, there are people who will not alter a mouthpiece or change a mouthpiece. They have a statement, it doesn't feel right. If you play by feel, and there's a very basic aspect of feel, in other words, of recognition by feel, you cannot change anything. If you're going along fairly well, hopefully you will remain in good shape in playing because the feel phenomena will be the same. Unfortunately, I think this is a very poor way to be. You cannot play by feel. The feel phenomena is really a very inadequate way of telling you when things are right or wrong. It's much better if you go by the sound and keep the art form of communication dominant, so you're actually talking to your audience with your instrument, not to yourself. So what I'm trying to indicate is that if you were to alter a cup of a mouthpiece, there is going to be altered feel, altered intonation. If, I assume most of you are advanced on your instruments, the reason I'm talking as I am, as an advanced player, as soon as you alter a mouthpiece in depth or in contour, you will alter intonation. As you practice on that mouthpiece, you have to very quickly search out the direction of alteration. In other words, you do this by finding the quality of tone, not the exact intonation. You have to find out where that went, where it changed. You find out where the qualities are on the note that match, so the quality of tone is even throughout the instrument. You raise or lower pitch from that point after you have found where you have established the correct sound. In other words, matching qualities of tone. And if you try for the intonation before that, you'll never know whether the horn's sharp, you're lipping down, or vice versa. You have to find where the instrument will have proper resonance. And once you do that, you'll find a freedom in changing cups. It's not a terribly important factor. When you take players as old as I am, and as old as most of those in the Chicago Symphony brass section, we get so bored that deliberately we walk on the stage with different mouthpieces. You've got to do something, when you're playing the Tchaikovsky Fifth. How often can you play that, and still keep inspiration at a high level? So you see Mr. Herseth come out with a strange-looking trumpet sometimes, and strange mouthpieces, and I do the same thing. I'll come out with altered cups, variable cups. Once in a while we put them away and quickly reach for the old one when there's a disaster. But most of the time things go well. Now, when you alter a mouthpiece, it should be not for your personal comfort, but for your ability to express yourself. In other words, if you're looking for specific qualities of tone, when I play, we'll say, a work that requires a little more of the French type of playing, I don't know if that valve will go, well, it should This type of articulation is not quite as good when you do it on the large mouthpiece. Sometimes it's better. But actually, there is a difference. And what I'm trying to indicate is that as you sense the need for altered qualities of tone, you can do it by alterations in your own embouchure. You can do it by mouthpiece, and of course you can do it by instrumental change, and frequently that would be the proper thing to do, but I'm just trying to indicate that there are other methods. Now, I want to, I can't show the variability of the instruments. I only have the one on the stage. Oh, you have the baritone? Good. Let's try we won't call it baritone. That's poor terminology. Piccolo tuba. Okay. First thing we do is take this mouthpiece out. I say, if you don't play by feel, it's amazing what you can do with other instruments, other mouthpieces, but you have to play by sound. That gets the trombone player sore. I keep going back to that old warhorse, but you need something stable that you can test a horn on, and I like to do that. Now, one of the things that I do like to suggest to a student, when I teach, which is a great deal, I find player after player coming to me all hung up because of the constant search for high notes on the tuba. If I had to pick any single phenomena that I would want to do combat with, it's this tremendous tendency to extend the upper range upward and upward and upward. I see the same thing in the young bass fiddlers. They're all playing down here. We tell them, get down into the money range, get back here, and that they're always there up. Well, cello is marvelous because then right away they're back, they're comfortable again. What I'm trying to indicate is that a person playing a brass instrument, there are certain things that have to be taken care of as you develop the ability to express yourself musically with the instrument. I think if you were to take an Arbon's trumpet book or any of the simple trumpet methods, you would find almost the key for the tuba. I'm speaking now of the elementary stage, where we don't want great range to be established immediately. I have a reason for it, in the sense that most of us who have learned to play on the tuba learned without very much instruction. I grew up in a little desert town in California and started out as a bugler, switched to trumpet, then finally trombone. I lost the trombone. Some bandmaster took advantage of the loss and handed me a tuba. And I was kind of stuck with it. But I did learn to play primarily without instruction. Now, I learned very much on the tuba just to repeat what I had done on the trumpet and trombone. And there's an orderly development about that, which has to do with the lip musculature, which has to do with the physical functions of playing, where actually great range does not become a hazard because of the amount of time that was spent in normal activities on the instrument in the mid-range and in the lower mid-range and low range. Now, I have player after player that comes to see me with hang-ups in a sense of malfunctioning embouchure. I have player after player that comes to see me with hang-ups in a sense of malfunctioning embouchure, malfunctions in the breath, and they're always trying to do the Vaughan Williams on their B-flat tubas, and many of them can do it. And many of them begin to lose the mid-range. There will be segmentation in the embouchure, rattle in the tones, the way it'll make itself noticed. I would like to suggest that along with the contrabass tuba, that the player should consider actually getting a mouthpiece. I don't think there's a commercial mouthpiece made. Schilke made mine for me. Merely copied the Helleberg rim and made a special cup that would fit into a baritone. It's contoured more for the baritone, and it gives the baritone a very nice, round quality of tone. But musically, it's very acceptable to the players. In other words, it sounds quite good when you play a simple B-flat scale. It becomes quite acceptable. Well, of course, that scale would be an octave higher on the large tuba in relationship to it. The embouchure form, in other words, the positioning of the embouchure, or what would be the proper terminology, the hypertrophy and enlargement of various small fibers that have to do with the shaping, the strengthening of the embouchure, comes in a situation where music is more compatible with the baritone and can be transferred back to the big tuba. I always insist that whatever is learned on the small instrument is transferred back. I do this when I work with trumpet players. Frequently, if I see a struggle going on the B-flat trumpet, the normal large trumpet, I might ask for the piccolo trumpet and start a musical development on the piccolo, but everything that is done on the piccolo, I always ask that it is redone on the big trumpet, so we don't have the phenomena of high notes on one instrument and low notes on a different instrument. Now, I'm suggesting this only because I think this is a marvelous, substitute for bypassing some of the distortions that come with playing very high notes on some of these large tubas. The smaller ones aren't quite so bad, but these monsters go flat on the high range. Some of them will go sharp, but the youngster is trying to play it in tune, so he's lipping the notes around. He's establishing all sorts of efforts which really do not belong. And I would think that by working on, you might say, in conjunction with an instrument of this type, it would be more compatible, and they would enjoy it more, and I think the instructor would enjoy it more because they would make much faster progress. Now, I'll just put this down. I'm still missing an F tuba. I don't know if I can get one here or not, if there's an F tuba in the building, but if there is, maybe I can get one functioning here a little also. I'm going to get into the heart of the clinic, I suppose. I have to, rather than work with a composer, I have to work with the person who plays the tuba, which is so much of what I think I'm actually brought here for. Yeah, the trouble with a horn like this, I know the bass and F, they're very nice, and he may never get this back.
Not mine.
Just thought I might have I have one of these at home, and I have a mouthpiece that fits right in these small mouth pipes. Just barely. This is quite a substantial tone for a tiny little horn of this type. I'll put the F-tuba mouthpiece in it. I used the large mouthpiece deliberately to enlarge that tone. I have to find out which one I'm using. I think it's so large because this microphone's on. Couldn't be that loud otherwise. What I'm playing, of course, is the from the Berlioz Romeo and Juliet. It's the opening recitative for brass. I don't know the number of our recording, but if you want to go out and buy it, why, fine and dandy. But anyway, it's typical writing for the F-tuba, and you can get the same range on the C. It's just as easy to play up there. But the sound characteristic, of course, is not what it should be. In fact, it's not at all proper. It's too wide, too thick of a tone, too much fundamental for this style of writing, although we do go into the extreme upper register on the contrabass tuba. But these three are marvelous. All you have to do is have a lot of money, and anybody can have them. And now, what we're dealing with, of course, is a human being, a person, a man or a woman who wants to play a brass instrument. Now, where I go into this, I always feel that we're talking about the tuba player, the trumpet player. We should be talking about the man who plays trumpet, the man who plays tuba, the man who is in an art form where he has to communicate to others. All art forms have certain basic characteristics. Otherwise, they would not be an art form. It is the ability to express yourself through the media of your choice. It could be a paintbrush and a canvas, an actress or an actor on the stage. Obvious how they express themselves. They interpret other parts, other persons' lives, but they do it and they become very believable. In a sad scene, you might go away crying, or in a happy one, you'll smile or you'll laugh if it's funny. But all art forms are forms of communication. Now, basically, they must be to somebody else, not to yourself. It's so very important that this is understood because it establishes a pattern that should be there from the time a person enters it. I dare say that the very successful tuba player, I'm thinking now of Harvey, I'm thinking of many other young tuba players, I'm thinking of myself as a child. We loved sound. I can remember myself as a youngster playing bugle. I got in trouble. I would go from a scout meeting playing my bugle 9 o'clock in the evening and playing the bugle all the way home. And the neighbors would complain, people would come out and tell me to be quiet. but there was a tremendous extroversion there. I was communicating, but in a sort of a nasty sort of way. But what I want to indicate here is that from the time you start playing an instrument, I always consider the most elementary player an elementary performer. And I didn't know why I felt this way until, I guess in the middle 40s, I started to study biology. After I had gone through structure and function and stayed with human biology, I found very many interesting things after the fact, and just studying what people do and why we do things as motivation and what their physical meanings will be. Some very interesting, I think, insights came out of this type of study. One, of course, is the habits of thought are very, very strong in each individual. The way we tend to think about, in the silence when you're alone, what your thoughts are. Usually you'll find they're words of one type or another where you're mulling over things in your mind. Now, what we're dealing with in playing a brass instrument, we're dealing with an acoustical device set up by a factory. This device has basically 3 valves. You can add a 4th as an extension valve for intonation, additional range. You can add a 5th, but it's still basically a 3-valve instrument. Any fine player can play on his instrument 3 octaves easily. Some will do 4, some will do more than that. It's obvious that with 3 valves, the horn is not giving us the pitch. In other words, it is not like a piano where our cat sometimes runs down the keyboard and plays. It's not very good music, but I hear it. And on that basis, I want to indicate that with a brass instrument, we have something, I think, quite different, we'll say, than the woodwind player and the percussionist or the pianist. Now, let me establish one thing right from the beginning. When I talk about a pianist, I'm speaking about an extremely difficult instrument to play. I'm speaking about a brain that has to be extremely adept in the art form of communication. In other words, they have challenges that are far beyond what we'll ever have on an instrument like the tuba. And so I respect the pianist, and I come from a family where piano was dominant. I was the black sheep of playing a brass instrument. But what I want to indicate right away is that when I say that the pianist has a tactile sense, in other words, when he touches, he feels, he is getting a feedback through his fingers, he's getting awareness of function and a connection with the keyboard where he can express himself in his art form, and a very complex one at that, but he has a sense, an extra sense that we do not have on the brass instrument. Now, what I'm trying to indicate here is that I studied voice for 12 years, and it gave me a little insight into this, and having studied anatomy, structure, function, I find the similarities with the brass instrument are just enormous in many, many respects. The applications are somewhat different, but there are basic similarities. One is that we'll never know what we're doing. Now, we have to know what we're doing as musicians, but we'll never know what we're doing in sense of physical structures at work. We can only get signals from a small number of muscles that are functioning, and we miss all sorts of signals from other muscles that we cannot know about. We have no proprioceptors. We don't have a nerve in many of the muscles that are going to feed to the thinking part of the brain. It'll feed to the brain, but to other levels. But the part that we are conscious with will not be able to perceive in a physical sense what we're doing. In other words, somesthetic analysis would be the term that we would use. Now, we are not going to know what we're doing. I think this is so important that people realize that in this art form, we do not have to know what we're doing. We have to know what our message is going to be. We have to have fuel, air. We have to use it, but we don't play by air. I'm brought here to give a clinic which will probably be dominant on respiratory activity, but I have to indicate, even before we get started on it, that we never play a brass instrument by air. We play by song. We use air, but we don't play by air. We play by song. In other words, we go by the complete product, the message, not by air. By blowing breath, our embouchures does not have to respond. You can do that all day and not have a sound. There has to be another element added for the embouchure to function. And when we do, the breath becomes fuel. It's a very important phenomena, but it is not the end product. It is not the art form that we're working with. It's only a segmented part of it. So I want to stress right away that the relationship of the clarinetist, we'll say, who uses breath, his connection to his instrument in terms of phrase, dynamic, and so forth, is through his breath. Now, he has a wooden reed. His embouchure helps the ligaturing aspect of the reed, so my friends tell me I'm not a clarinetist, but I do work with good ones, and they gave me this information. But their embouchure has to do with certain aspects that reinforce and alter the ligaturing aspect of the reed. He uses his breath as the motor force in order to vibrate the reed. The instrument has to do with the resonance of that vibrating reed. Now, part of it is sympathetic, part of it is forced. It's primarily a forced resonance compared to the brass instrument, which is primarily sympathetic. Now, what I want to get into in this is a recognition that the woodwind player, in the aesthetics of his art form, he can be very, very much alerted to the use of breath and speak about the breath. You cannot do that as a singer. In other words, you must be alerted to the song. You must be alerted to the communication to your audience. So it is not just a sound, it is also how you express yourself, facial activity, gestures, body language. In other words, it's all involved. On a brass instrument, where our reed is flesh and blood, we have to beware that we do not play by breath. At the same time, we can't neglect the breath. But we play by sound, we play by song. I much prefer to put it to you that way. Our embouchures do not have to respond to the flow of air. Our embouchures, if you stand in front of the mirror and you make funny faces in front of the mirror, you'll find you can take your lips and twist them all around. In other words, we have various muscles which will pull the lips inward, protract them outwards, elevate them, depress them. They're very complex structures. And these complex structures form to give you a set of, I like to put it as vocal cords for the instrument. Da-da-da-dum. Doesn't have to be right. But what I want to indicate, there is a song. Now, what's involved here is simply in a human being, the part of the brain that you do volitional thinking with is not in charge of your physical functions. It's in charge with what you do with your body to influence the external environment, but it is not in charge through direct wiring hookups to the internal environment. It goes through emotions, it goes through all sorts of other states to influence the internal activities. What I want to indicate very strongly is that I have many students that come to see me that are very much involved in self-analyses. Now, the part of the brain that we think with is the part that permits us to ask questions or to issue statements. But it does not permit us in itself for my arm to raise up like that. It has to signal that I want my arm in the upper position, and many, many muscles throughout the body go to work. In other words, my scapula has to fix back there. The arm in this position has altered gravitational factors, the electromyographic readings all over the body which show activity. In other words, a simple maneuver is enormously complex from the machine aspect of a human body and function. And yet it's very simple. If I throw up a ball and catch it, it's very simple to do that. But I have to throw the ball up and I have to catch it. As soon as I go by the chain of command that permits my arm to be in a position, I'm going to spoil it. I have to get the hand under the ball and I've got it. As soon as I start to go by the procedure of getting there, we're in the way and we're in all sorts of trouble. What I'm trying to indicate very strongly is that the part of the brain which asks a question is also the part of the brain which issues a statement. Now, we have other levels of the brain that have to do with firing up the muscles, giving us the coordinate phenomena. I know this is not a simple subject for a musician to think in, but I'm trying to give the proper analogous situations to where it'll make some sense to you. But when I speak to you, I have something to say. In order for me to say it, I'm using articulation. I'm using tongue, lips, laryngeal activity, respiratory activity, body language. I'm using facial expression. Many, many parts of me are working based on conditioned response to stimuli. Now, the very fact that I have something to say is making it very easy for me to do it. I merely present my case to you. I very frequently will take a student who is turning inwards, and I'll ask him to give me a very complex discourse on any subject, but a complex one, and analyze his respiration, phonation. In other words, question himself as he's making the speech. Very quickly, he has nothing to say. But I have people on brass instruments doing this all the time. Well, you can't do that. In other words, you influence the phenomena, even the things that are wrong. You don't make them right. You abandon them. You substitute new habits. In other words, you don't fight old ones to correct them. You substitute new habits for the old ones. The new neural pathways form. The old one, through lack of re-stimulation, finally is quieted down as the new one develops. But in order to make this thing a little more sensible to you, I want to say that we have two types of nerves. We have motor nerves and we have sensory nerves. You all know the sensors. When I talk, you hear. That's an auditory nerve. That's a sensory nerve. You want to feel whether the water's hot or cold, you put your finger on it. There you have a sense of temperature. You have the tactile sense. You have the various senses that carry messages inward. Motor nerves are quite different. A nerve in a human body is a one-way street. A motor nerve carries a message from the brain to the effector, to the muscle that is going to contract. A sensor carries a nerve in the opposite direction. In electronics, we use a wiring hookup where we can send a message along a wire either way. You cannot do that with a human nerve. In other words, it goes one way only. Now, we play through the motor systems, not the sensors. The sensors are important. I'm not putting them down. But the emphasis in the musician must be always on the art of communication, so that one part of the brain is acting like a player piano roll, so the keyboards are stimulated into their proper function. We don't go to the correction of the keyboards, we go to the correction of the controls. It's like the study of machine systems. All machine systems have controls. All controls have to be programmed. When there is a malfunctioning embouchure, first you have to go to the brain, which is controlling the embouchure, and you don't correct the shape of the lip as the dominant factor. You make sure there's a musical message that's supposed to come out of the lip so that we'll have something for the lip to say. Now, that doesn't mean that the lip should not be in a proper form. It's simply that proper form in itself is not the end product. In other words, proper form, if you take for granted that the student has a musical thought, then he'll function with proper form. But many students at that time do not have a proper thought. They're going by the feel and the shape of the lip, and they have nothing. You must make sure that there's always a sound in the head that instead of registering as vocal cords here and sound, will register as vocal cords here and sound. Da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. And it's as I say, it's part of an art form. Dum da 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 dum. Da dum. It's just another voice. Da da dum. Now, for the lip to have something to say, it has to be always in the brain to be in the lip. You cannot take for granted, those of you that teach or those of you that play, that it's in the lip because you might have thought of it a minute before you started playing. As you play, you have to sing. You do not sing with the vocal cords, you sing with the lips, but you sing. That's the closest analogous situation that I can think of. I've seen this writing from many fine brass players before my time. They would say, learn to sing. Not as a physical application of going on the stage with your human voice, but to sing on your instrument. As someone well-versed in structure and function, there are physical reasons why this is valid. In other words, we must consider the player-piano role so we can have the keyboard activity, or you could liken it to the punched card for the computer. But we must have the message so that the physical activities can function. The subject is complex, and I would like a lot of questions from you on this because this should be clarified for you to get any benefit out of it. I like to teach it as a simple subject, and I very, very frequently will ask my students to sing a part and then play it. Now, many times they'll sing it, and when they go to play it, the mind blanks out. They've sung it a moment before, but they're not singing in the brain at the time they're playing, and as a result, there is still improper guidance. At that time, I will make up words. In other words, if they're playing, I make them sing, how dry I am. Then I'll have them actually concentrate on the words and pitch. Invariably, it begins to come with greater ease, and they'll find entrances that they could not get a moment before will come quite easily when they stop trying to develop the attack as a formalized procedure, but substitute the pronunciation of a word. The whole psychology of it changes, and the organization cerebrally alters. Because I hesitate to go into how complex we are in structure and function. You have no idea unless you have studied years of... You can't just study anatomy. You have to go into the physiological concepts, the chemical aspects. You have to go into enormous study to even get the concept of truly how complex the human machine is. And then, when you do, you realize your only hope of success is to keep it simple. Now, I always played in my own lights. I learned to play by ear when I was a youngster because I didn't have a teacher or an instruction book. My first trumpet my father bought me was a little Wurlitzer trumpet, and he forgot to buy a book. So all I had was the trumpet, but I had played bugle before, so I learned to play by ear. I played a solo in our school in California with my sister accompanying me on piano. I hadn't played a year on the trumpet when I did this solo. I remember after I started studying the trumpet, I couldn't play that solo anymore. Well, it wasn't the fault of the teacher or anything. It was just simply I'd let go of this particular aspect of playing. But what I do want to indicate is that learning to play by ear means that a region of the brain is becoming very adept at recognition and recall. Now, recognition and recall is going to have a great deal to do with what you have to say as an instrumentalist. Now, the physical factors demand that you do not play by segmented parts, breath, tongue, embouchure, the various segmented parts. You play by song. Now, after the fact, you can analyze all the separate parts and segment them, but to integrate them in the proper function, you have to do it based on having a message. Now, if I had to pick any particular fault to find with many young players, I would say that 1 out of 10 has a musical inspiration. Usually they come to see me because they're in trouble. In other words, they'll come to long distances, and so as a result, a person in trouble worries. With worry, you tend to become hypersensitive to incoming stimuli. Usually with inspiration, you'd have a message to deliver and things go somewhat better. But so often I will get people coming to see me in a rather worried or harassed state. I have to turn that young mind around and make a storyteller out of them right away. It is so important that I can't stress it too much. I like to phrase it as you have a tuba in the hand and you have a tuba in the head. The tuba in the head has no valves, has no embouchure, but it has sound. This is the one you concentrate on, and you allow the one in the hand to become a mirror. In other words, it is the media through which you express yourself. Now, I find that many players will use lip service to this type of thought, but when the horn is in the hands, they don't do it. They don't have a message. They play by air, by fingers, and by resistance, the various feel phenomena. I have to somehow break into that. I use the technique of song. In other words, I may establish words. I stood out in front of Remington's studio one time when we were playing in Eastman with the Chicago Symphony. The first thing I heard was he's singing da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-dum with his student. That voice sounded constantly. Well, the indication here is that you program your physical structures, you program yourself by, you might say, 2 types of thought processes. One is the imitative act. The other is the creative. But one or the other should be in constant use. If I were to play da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum and ask a student to do it, we'll say on the mouthpiece without a horn. He can usually imitate very readily, start copying my voice right away. I'll give him a few little tricky rhythms. Ba-ba-doo-bop, ba-ba-doo-bop. Very quickly they're doing it on the mouthpiece. But the imitative act is feeding signals from one level of the brain, programming other cortical levels to where the physical structures are being responsive. I bring that into being very, very early because this is one of the chief tools that we use in an art form, the creative aspect, the ability to have something to say. If I have a player, we'll say he's a trumpet player, I have him listen to somebody like Bud Herseth, and I ask him to, here's a part, fairly simple one. How would Bud sound like it? Think a moment. What would he sound like? Demonstrate what you think he would sound like on this phrase. Player will play way over his head. He begins to sound like Herseth because he's thinking of sounding like him. But you can see what I'm talking about right away. Psychomotor activity, the programming of motor systems is through the psyche. And what we have to establish here are concepts of playing. Now, that doesn't mean we neglect our other aspects of playing, but we keep a dominance of being performers, of having something to say to somebody else. Like the actor on the stage, you read a set of lines, you read it with the idea that you're going to reinterpret it if you want to express hate. I hate that! I can think of some conductors. I can turn that on like that. And I love, yes, I could do that too. Laughter, but you can find that when you think of a thought that brings about an emotional state, you've also brought about all sorts of physical response associated with it. I'm trying to indicate the same thing when we play our instruments is not to have a question in the brain, but a statement. That statement should not be of the physical procedure, but of the sound phenomena. What we're dealing with is the conditioned response to a specific stimulus. The stimuli should not be the spoken word, it should be the sound. If we use song, then we use the word with sound. But it must be basically sound which will excite the embouchure into pitch, coordinate the various physical functions. That we go right back into the art form where we belong. I've studied this subject for so many years, and I cannot use measurement phenomena in my own playing. In other words, I do not play by my knowledge of structure and function. I play as a storyteller with a tuba. Just like Harvey does, great artist with his tuba. Any great brass player, any great musician. We are storytellers, only we don't use words, we use sounds. Harvey does, great artist with his tuba. Any great brass player, any great musician. We are storytellers, only we don't use words, we use sounds. But we do bring in our physical structures then in a proper manner. Would you like to ask questions about this? Because I get wound up on this and I won't let anybody talk.
Well, you were saying if you've got an image, then theoretically it should come out in the act. What is it that usually gets in the way between the tuba in the head and the tuba in the hand?
The first thing you go to, of course, is the fact that an image in time may not be there as you do the physical maneuver of playing. In other words, the man with a poor attack, if he had to have ta, may, at the time he has here ta, but when he sets up the embouchure and breath, it blanks out here. At the instant it's needed, it's gone. Then I may ask for a word, or I'll use the illustration of a bell and a hammer, boing, so it synchronizes, and usually the note is right there. But I'm working again with the brain rather than the structures, because I permit a wide range of bad embouchure and bad physical techniques until we have the musical dominance, and from then on, through the musical challenges, we correct many of the physical structures. Did that answer? Now, would you like me to clarify any of this? Yes, sir.
Do you vocalize every day before you play?
I haven't vocalized seriously in 30 years. I'm giving my age away, I think, now, but I do vocalize when I teach voice to a certain extent. But occasionally, I have brass players, for instance, who, after all, in singing, you have to have an open palate at times and so forth. And on brass, if you had an open palate, the air would be coming out of the nose. So we do run into some problems. And so every now and then I will work with a vocal student. And then, of course, I vocalize quite a bit just to get in shape. But I do solfege quite a bit every day. But I don't do what I did when I was a vocal student, extensive work for the stage or anything of that type. Although, if I only had time, I would. I love it. Yes, sir.
I think thinking about concept experience.
You can draw from others' experiences which become yours.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
One must be exposed to so many tones.
Well, this is the thing, you know, imagination, of course, is a very important tool. This is Mike Russell, right? I thought I recognized you there in the distance. But, Mike, what we're dealing with here is it's always nice to be able to hear a player. In other words, go to concerts, listen to as many players as you can. But a tuba player can imitate a trumpet player and get marvelous results. You can imitate a violinist and get marvelous results. It does not have to be tuba, but it has to be music. But what I'm indicating here is the imitative act. For instance, when I'm around the orchestra a lot, you know, and with Beethoven, sometimes I have nothing to play. I fool around. Here's just a little passage. And so forth and so on. I hear my colleagues do things. So I go home and in the privacy of my studio, I do them. Now, you can see right away that is programming the brain. Now, with records, you can do the same thing. You listen to other players. It doesn't come out of a vacuum, in other words. I really feel, you know, that one of our big problems, when I get to the composers that are here, one of our big problems is that in the past, tuba has been assigned a very limited type of music to interpret. Now, of course, we're all F clef here, so we know what that means, you know. But we can also see that a limited musical challenge is going to develop a limited musician. Now, we have to, of course, get out of that period, and I think thanks to Harvey and many other young players like him and Bill Bell before him, that much of that phase is behind us. But for many, many years, the talented young tuba player had to imitate the trumpet. He had to go to the school of horn or trumpet or violin, but he could do nothing with the tuba. In other words, the actual taking home of tuba music, there was nothing to challenge him that would really give him the ladder where he could climb to become an excellent interpreter of music. And as a person, we are not tuba players, we are people. And to develop our brains and our abilities, we must be given the type of challenge that will give us the development. And in the past, from my period, I primarily went to the school of French horn, school of violin, school of voice, but I did very little with the tuba music. Otto Lange, I'll tell you a story about that. Do I have time, Harvey?
Go right ahead.
This Otto Lange method book. When we lost my trombone, we were touring in Texas. In those days, in the 20s, we had running boards on cars, and my horn disappeared. I was living in Santa Monica at the time, in California, and the bandmaster gave me a trombone. And, of course, I had to fool around with a trombone for quite a while. What was my topic? I was going to tell them a story about... what was the story? I was going to...
Otto Lange.
Oh, Otto Lange. Well, what happened there? This is so long ago, and Otto Lange now is so foreign to my thinking. But at that time, they gave me the tuba book, Otto Lange Method for Tuba, and a big King sousaphone. It said the low range of the tuba. I was 15 years old. It says it goes down to a low E, goes up to a high B flat. So I had a ball with it, you know. They put me in the Newsboys band right away. I was principal tuba because I had the technique, you know, from the trumpet and trombone and range, and it was great. And they sent me up to the Curtis Institute after a year for an audition. And I had the Arbon Carnival of Venice worked up. I did the whole thing. Herbert Clark, Stars in the Velvety Sky. I had that worked up for my audition. And I couldn't use a sousaphone, so I had a little E-flat tuba with a fourth valve tied down and the slides pulled, so I could use it as a double beat. And I went up for this audition. We had, the younger ones wouldn't remember Joseph Hoffman, but he was a famous pianist of a different era. And Marcel Tabateau, the old first oboist of the Philadelphia Orchestra. We had a very distinguished faculty there auditioning, and several adults came out and played, and then I came out with this horn tied together with string and taped down, and I started out with my solos. They let me play through them, and then they brought out the Flying Dutchman Overture. The Flying Dutchman, pa-pum, pum, pa-pum, 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 goes up to, I think, a high C. And I missed the high C, and so they said, try it again. I says, I can only go to a high B flat on this tuba. And so they laughed. They said, try it again. Well, the second time I played it, but I didn't think too much about it, you know. I was given the scholarship, and that was fine. But the instruction book had put a handicap in my way by not indicating that there is range beyond high B flat and low E. But that's your range for the B flat tuba. In my second year at the Curtis Institute of Music, I was studying Benvenuto Cellini, which goes to a G above our high C. And I was having a terrible time playing that note. And Mr. Donatelli, my instructor, a fine tuba player, and but he rarely played for me. But I asked him, would he play this part for me? And so he took my tuba, and he played it, and he played it very well. But I noticed that right before he went to the high G, he shifted his embouchure on the mouthpiece. He moved down lower on the mouthpiece, and a light went on in my head. Said, he broke a rule. He shifted on the mouthpiece there, but he got the high G, and it sounded good. I was a former trumpet player. As soon as I saw that, and I broke the rules, I not only had high G, but I had G above high G. I haven't had a bad time with high notes since. But the Ottolenghi method, with its high B flat and low E, had me stymied for a while. So what I want to indicate, of course, you know, by this is for a brass player, if the music is the dominant phenomena and procedure is a minor, but you go for the art form of communication to others, and you don't set rules of procedure, but you set rules of result, I think you'll find a very happy situation develops. If you set rules of procedure, it fits a certain group and bypasses others. Now, we read out all sorts of favorable things from the advanced player, but the person who has to learn it very frequently will be handicapped if he is taught to follow a certain procedure. For instance, if you do not allow a change of embouchure as conceived by maybe a stabilized embouchure today, I don't have to make the changes that I did when I was 15, 16 years old. But until the musculatures go into hypertrophy and learn their tasks and so forth through the act of playing, then many changes will be gross and crude, just like in athletics. The refinements come with experience and skill. They do not come until you have acquired the skill. And in any physical structure, you have to allow this period of development. But if you set rules as to procedure, many players are going to be handicapped. If you set rules that the mouthpiece must fit a certain way on your lips, this is fine for the person with the neuromuscular pattern similar to the teacher's and poison to the one with dissimilar neuromuscular patterns. In other words, the location of the nerve, the excellence of some of the tissues, and so forth may be quite different. Jaw structure may be quite different. Allowed to find his own way, he may get a very excellent result, but if he has to do it in a formalized way, he may wind up in insurance or some other field because he'll be unable to cope with the problem. But what I'm trying to say is that by formalizing the art form, I really feel the player moves ahead very, very fast. And I am making my little speech because of so many players who come to me without actually being interpreters of music. They talk about music, they write, they use physical aspects of music, but they don't think in the art form of music, and I really feel that this has to be stressed. I guess I must be running out of time because I see something out of the corner of my eye here.
Well, I think that everyone in here has plenty to think about from this session with Mr. Jacobs. And I think he's earned a chance to have a good meal since he drove here without having lunch. And I would like to propose that we start our next session at 6:30, and that we can, if necessary, go into our half-hour intermission this evening. I know you're going to have many, many questions, and I know that dining hall is going to be very noisy with buzzing conversations. The meal hour is plugged in, and the clock is running, and when the gong sounds, the people who are running our food service, unfortunately, are not tuba players. So I urge you to hold to the schedule, be back here at 6:30 promptly, and we'll get started with our second session with Mr. Jacobs. Thank you very much.
Harvey, can I leave her?